Welcome to the 12th edition of the joint Brown-Harvard-MIT seminar on South Asian politics. Prerna Singh at Harvard and I at Brown and Vipin Narang at MIT.
Turn it back on?
Yeah. Started this seminar in 2011. And it's gone on. But this year, there's a change. The change is that we are not meeting at MIT at all. Our MIT co-chair is serving the Clinton administration for 2 years. So our meetings will rotate between Harvard and Brown. And Harvard co-chair at this point, because Prerna now is a colleague of ours at Brown, is Emmerich, who's sitting here. Let's start with the substance of the talk today. Uttar Pradesh, my native state, is 17.35% of India. Every sixth Indian is from UP. It sends 80 MPs to the 543 elected, and there are 2 which are not elected in Lok Sabha. 543 elected members of Lok Sabha. It used to have 84 before Uttarakhand was born. 8 out of 15 prime ministers of India since 1947 have come from Uttar Pradesh. At the present moment, the population is 233.4 million, which makes it the 6th largest country in the world if it were a country of its own. China, 1.41 billion, India, 1.4 billion, United States, 338 million, Indonesia, 275 million, Pakistan, 235.8 million, UP, 233.4 million. Bigger than Nigeria, which is next, bigger than Brazil. Those that are more than 200 million are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, including UP. It also is among the poorest states of India, has among the lowest human development indicators. That also, perhaps, as we might note today or may not, depending on how the discussion goes, might have some impact on, clearly identifiable, perhaps, impact on the politics of the state. Now, if every 6th Indian is from UP, and UP, if it were a country, would be the 6th largest country in the world, then clearly what happens in UP politics is a matter of grave interest, and should be a matter of grave interest to India as a whole. One might note that between 1993 and 2007, UP was not a powerful player in Delhi, despite its size, because the parties that were ruling Delhi were not very important, or were 3rd or 4th most important parties in Uttar Pradesh. And a state like Tamil Nadu, between 93 and 2009, maybe up to 2014, one could argue, had a very powerful role to play in Delhi, despite the fact that it's the 5th largest state in India. And the reason for that political equation was very simple. Either DMK was part of government or ADMK was part of government in a coalition government, right? It was always in power. Tamil Nadu was always in power between 93 and 2014. But with the return of one-party dominance or one-party majority in UP, which did not have, where no single party had a majority between 93 and 2007, for 14 years. It went back and forth between various parties, but finally 2007 onwards, every election has produced a majority. for a party, and that, as we'll see, will be analyzed at some length, and it has changed. It has changed the relationship of UP and Delhi quite significantly. Our speaker today, Gilles Verniers, is currently Assistant Professor of Political Science at Ashoka University and co-director of its new but very well-known Trivedi Centre for Political Data. He is leaving Ashoka at the end of this year and joining a Center for Policy Research in Delhi. But this semester, he is Carl Lowenstein, visiting fellow and assistant professor at Amherst College. He was educated in Belgium and France. His bachelor's is in economics and social and political sciences from Brussels. And his PhD in political science is from Sciences Po in Paris. And he's been in India for a very long time, and not only a scholar who's enlightened us a lot, but someone who's also a public intellectual, writes columns regularly and is on television a great deal. And our commentator is Thibaut Marseille, assistant professor of comparative and South Asian politics at Boston College. His PhD, he is from Cornell. He's become a member of our community here around this seminar. And one stipulation for both of them is that they are not going to speak in French. They'll speak in English. Their first language, both have, French is the first language of both our speaker and the discussant. So welcome, Gilles. Next 40 to 50 minutes are yours, and then I'll invite Thibaut.
So thank you, Ashutosh, for your hospitality. Thank you to the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia for inviting me here, and thank you for a very generous introduction. So this talk today is going to be about UP politics, and I'm going to assume a fair deal of familiarity with politics in general in India, but at the same time, I'm trying not to make this talk too much inside cricket about the who's who of UP politics, but try to look at some of the notable transformation that have occurred, not only ever since the BJP has come to power in 2017 in that state, but in the period that precedes it from the early 2000s onwards. So ever since the BJP has come to power in UP, it has been making a lot of claims about how it is transforming politics in that state and how it has transformed itself as well. It claims to have transformed and improved the welfare distribution regime, favoring direct benefits to the old systems of mediated redistribution. It claims to have restored law and order by passing tough legislations on crime and by condoning practices that used to belong to the realm of vigilantism. It claims to have put the state on a path towards becoming a $1 trillion economy, which is 4 times its current size. And it also claims to have become an all-encompassing inclusive political party that provides representation and opportunities to backward groups that have been historically ignored by mainstream or other political parties in UP. And it's really this claim of inclusiveness that I'm interested to examine in this paper by looking at major parties' practices, nomination strategies, by looking at state elections, representational outcome, and by looking also at the question of the distribution of power between groups within party and government once elections are over. I do this by using 3 data sets, which have been prepared at the Center for Politics. The Lok Dabba data set is a repository of Indian election results and constituency level data. The individual incumbency data set tracks politicians and candidates' career trajectories by matching candidates' names over time, thousands and thousands and thousands of candidates. And the Indian elected representative and candidates data set contains a wealth of socio-demographic data about major parties' candidates, including jati or caste of candidates, religion, political family affiliations, or dynastic profile, but also affidavit data containing information on assets, education, occupation, and the UP dataset also includes information extracted from the parliamentary who's who. The first two datasets are public, and they cover all Indian states back to independence. The candidates dataset, it's still a work in progress because we are covering 20 states. So the same data exists for 20 states, all major states in India, again, going back to independence. It's a large collaborative effort. It's been a large collaborative effort led at TCPD by Christophe Jaffrelot and I, but it involves, this kind of work involves many colleagues, many research assistants. And so to put things in a nutshell, this data, particularly the descriptive data on caste, help us to verify empirically the claims of inclusion made by political parties and to underline some of the limits of some of these claims. So the paper and this presentation are organized as follows. First, I look at the case for inclusion within the BJP, what have been the nomination practices, what have been its representational outcomes. Then I put the 2017 and 2022 elections in perspective with previous elections to see how the BJP compares with its predecessors. Then I look at occupation data and assets data to make the case that the caste-based diversity that we observe in the UP Assembly today overshadows the fact that on many other variables, political recruitment across political parties is actually quite elitist and leads to the formation of a political class that is, on the one hand, heterogeneous on the basis of caste affiliation, but quite homogeneous on almost every other socioeconomic variable. And finally, I look at the relations between inclusion and actual power distribution within parties in government before discussing some of the implications of the facts observed. So, as you know, the 2022 State Assembly elections in UP saw the incumbent Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath re-elected with a single majority. This verdict was historic because no chief minister in UP since Govind Vara Pant before and after independence ever succeeded to win a consecutive elections after having served a full term. This is the first time that it happens in 75 years. The 2022 elections also broke a series of 3 consecutive elections that saw 3 single majorities won by 3 different parties, which also was unprecedented. The BSP, the Bahujan Samaj Party in 2007, the SP, the Samajwadi Party in 2012, and of course the BJP in 2017. These 4 elections taken together, I argue, mark a new phase in the politics of a state that had been until then an epitome of political instability. No less than 8 different governments attempted and failed to govern India's largest state through the 1990s. Before 2022, the average chief minister's tenure in UP since independence has been of 2 years and 19 days. The state has also been placed 10 times under president's rule for a total of 4 years and 228 days. So,
can I pause you for a moment?
Yes.
So this average that you get in 2 years and 90 days, right, since independence, can be further broken up. So you have the non-Congress multi-party governments emerging around 1969, I think, right? 69 or 71?
Yes, 67.
67,
yeah.
67. And then basically before 67, 10 years were no.
No. 10 years have been short. There have been a rotation or a turnover of chief minister at all times because of the factionalism that always existed within the Congress party. from the fact also that the appointment of chief ministers in UP was usually decided by the High Command and was the result of tractations between different factions of the party in UP, the AICC. And so there's always been a great instability, no matter which party governed was elected, right? It really, Mayawati is the first to serve a full term in 2007. And so these 4 elections have been won by 3 parties that arguably are very different one from the other, but their campaigns shared at least one important common theme, which was the theme of inclusion. All 3 parties claimed to incarnate some sort of a rainbow coalition of castes. All 3 parties sought to mobilize voters beyond their traditional support base, which they had built over time in previous elections, in previous decades. And they did so by adopting inclusive political discourses, but also by using recruitment, candidate recruitment, as a tool of party diversification. In 2007, the BSP extended a hand to Brahmin voters by nominating many Brahmin candidates. In 2012, the SP, the Samajwadi Party, made an effort to broaden its recruitment by including more Rajputs and more non-Yadav backward candidates. And in 2017, the BJP's victory translated into a great resurgence of upper caste representation, as the party gave nearly half of its tickets to upper caste candidates. And in 2022, it sought to correct that image of a pro-upper caste party by inducting more candidates drawn from a variety of lower backward castes. So the Lokniti CS data on voting shows that all 3 parties in the respective elections that they won succeeded in getting votes across caste groups, across a wide spectrum of voters and caste, beyond their respective core support groups. And so at face value, these parties have become more diverse as they seek to attract votes from segments of the electorate that are not traditionally aligned to them, notably through the tool of candidate nominations. And so if we look at descriptive data on caste representation, it shows that there is some justification for these claims, but it also reveals at the same time that there are limitations. So consider this table, for example, which shows how BJP tickets are distributed across a wide range of groups in the last 2 elections, 2017 and 2022. In 2022, the BJP distributes 107 tickets to candidates belonging to 22 different backward caste groups, 124 if you include Jats among them, which is a marked increase from the past. 15 years ago, the BJP distributed about half the number of tickets that it did in 2022 to a much smaller number of rather important or demographically important backward groups. And the same goes for scheduled castes. The BJP in 2017 and 22 distributed tickets to a large number of Dalit groups, a larger array of castes than it used to in the past. Muslims are completely excluded, which is a powerful signal from the BJP to voters about his views on the ownership of the public sphere. And if you break down this caste category into Jati, you find that most of the BJP, OBC, and many of the Dalit candidates belong to groups that can be termed as non-dominant in demographic term, in social term, in economic term, and historically in political term as well. Non-Yadav OBCs, non-Jatav Dalits, right? And these 2 groups which remain somewhat aligned with its adversary, the BSP and the SP. And given the amplitude of the performance of the BJP in these 2 elections, the representational outcome more or less matched the distribution of caste that you see among the candidates. Yes.
I know this question cannot be fully statistically resolved, but there are fairly intelligent guesses available. What is your guess about what proportion of UP is Brahmin? What proportion of UP is non-Brahmin upper caste?
Yeah.
What proportion of UP is Yadav? What proportion of UP is non-Yadav OBC? what proportion of UP is Jata and what proportion of UP is non-Jata.
So
All of us have good speculations about that. You would have a much better speculation than many of us.
So at the top of my head, Brahmins make roughly 6-7% of the population. Yadav make 9% of the population. Jatav make 12% of the population. Overall, upper caste represent 20% of the population. You have 19% Muslim, 22% Dalit, and remaining of actually more than 40% remaining is actually OBCs.
Right. So you know that some of us are associated with the proposal that in the UP is 20, 20, 20, 40. 20 upper caste, 20 Muslim, 20 roughly, plus minus something, Dalit, and 40 OBC. So the basic cut is this, and then within the 20, 20, 20, 40, you get these various other cuts, subcuts within those programs.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is an endless conversations about classification also. Should we consider Jat as OBCs or not? And there's been also movement. Certain castes have labeled under a certain category, but then are labeled under different categories over time. So the coding actually of caste is a very complex exercise. But
and one more thing before, so that we understand the All India perspective can be understood. Other than Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, UP has the largest proportionately speaking, the largest concentration of upper caste.
That would be correct, yes. In most other states in the Hindi belt,
20% upper caste anywhere except Himachal and Uttarakhand.
Actually, Uttarakhand is closer to 40%. Yeah.
And Himachal is 30%.
And Himachal, exactly. That's right.
Just to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, if you look at, I'm sorry, it's a lot of figures, but if you look at nomination data over the last 4 elections, and this time presented in percentage terms, you see that the strategy of inclusion of lower OBCs remains somewhat within the BJP, remains somewhat modest. There are still more Rajput candidates within the BJP in 2022 than all lower OBCs candidates combined. And you see also that the inclusion of lower OBCs within the BJP through the ticket distribution is something that came incrementally rather than spectacularly in 2017. And in fact, an electoral strategy that seeks to combine support from the upper caste and non-dominant OBCs or non-Yadav OBCs is hardly new to the BJP. This is what it did in UP in the early 90s to counter precisely the political rise of the Yadavs. This is what the BJP has done across the Hindi belt in the 90s when it appointed chief ministers such as Kalyan Singh or Uma Bharti, who are low caste, who are lower OBCs, to counter the rise of backward parties. What was spectacular was the size of the victory, the amplitude of the victory of the BJP in 2017, which brought in parliament many more OBC, BJP, and SC BJP MLAs than in the past. But in terms of proportion, we see that the induction of lower OBC candidates has been incremental and has not led to a particular or significant dilution of upper caste representation within the BJP. Upper caste in 2022 still make 44% of all the BJP candidates. So you put that in perspective with the fact they represent 20% of the population, gives you a rough idea of the degree of overrepresentation that these categories have within a party like the BJP, right? So they make 44% of all BJP MLAs in 2022, or if I wanted to be a bit more rhetorical, I could say that they make 60% of all the MLAs elected in general seats, right? So these figures, but nonetheless, there is a distribution, right? And this distribution is consonant with the fact that the BJP has succeeded to considerably broaden its support across caste groups, and particularly among the backward groups. Yeah.
So you're basically saying that this is 20% of the population, but 44% of those elected.
That's right.
This is 40% of the population, but 28% elected.
That's right.
This is 20% of the total population, but 22% 2.7%.
Yeah, but it's mandated representation because it's through reserve
This
seats.
is mandated because these are reserve seats.
That's right.
Right. So the OBCs, while rising, are still not their proportion of population.
It's still very far from it.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is twice as large.
Yeah. So
This is for the BJP MLAs, right?
this is for this is only for the BJP MLAs. Yeah. So what is interesting is that there is a claim of diversification that takes place, which is somewhat justified by the inclusion of a larger number of candidates drawn from OBCs and by the election of a larger number of them, but on the back of a wider performance at large, but not at the cost of the dilution of the core support base of the BJP among the upper caste. And so CSDS Lokniti data on voting basically shows us how the BJP has succeeded in consolidating support from every group, with the exception of a few lower OBCs and not even among Muslims, right? In the BJP, in 2022, the BJP increases its support across almost every social category, right? And with a degree of cohesiveness of upper caste support for the BJP that it has never experienced, not even in the early 90s, at the height of the Ayodhya movement, right? And so the BJP's claim of being a diverse party can be looked from the point of view of its composition, where it is somewhat true but somewhat limited. But it actually finds more veracity from the point of view of the composition of its electoral base, which cuts across almost every caste group, with the exception of Muslims, and to a certain extent, Yadav and Jatav as well, which remain affiliated with regional parties. So my argument is that the logic of diversification or inclusion among the political class and electoral behavior are becoming somewhat disconnected questions. Voters don't only respond to nominations. And while we don't know a lot about the determinants of electoral behavior in India, we know that there's a multiplicity of factors that are at play in the shaping of voters' decisions. And for many of them, the identity of the candidate may not just be, or maybe just a remote consideration.
Can I ask you one more data question? 89% of Brahmins voted for BJP.
Yeah.
Is there any time in UP's electoral history where 89 or 90% Brahmins voted for any single party?
No.
No, right? The answer is no.
No, not that I'm aware, no.
So almost 90% of Brahmins voting for, out of the 7%, voting for BJP that's also completely novel phenomenon.
It's not, no, I mean, there was a high degree of cohesiveness in the late 80s and the first phase of the first rise of the BJP in UP, right? Mm-hmm. But it was never at that degree of cohesiveness. I mean, we can have, it's a separate conversation about, why are, Brahmin in this case voting, I mean.
And Brahmins did not vote for the Congress party when it was dominant in such numbers.
Never. I mean, we don't have a lot a lot on voting behavior in the 50s and 60s. No. The first election surveys start in 67, actually.
Okay, so we don't know that.
When support was already, waning. So voters don't necessarily respond to, candidate nominations or the identity of candidates, but the inclusion of non-dominant backward groups candidates, the appointment of several visible backward classes ministers, the deployment of pro-backward classes policies and schemes, all have a role to play. And also the inclusion of these OBC group into a larger ethno-nationalist discourse plays a very important role in the reshaping of the party's image as an inclusive, diverse, anti-establishment party. The establishment in the case of UP is incarnated by the BSP and the SP, parties that became representative of the new elites of the state who emerged through the cooptation of local strongmen who belonged in large numbers to locally dominant groups among the backwards and beyond. So in 2017, the BJP formulated a 60-40 strategy consisting of mobilizing the 60% of the population that was not Yadav, Jatav, or Muslim. And by doing so, the BJP sought to cultivate and bank on the resentment generated by a strong perception of power capture by Yadav and Jatav under the SP and BSP regime. Policy preferentialism, capture of reservation benefits. So these are all themes that the BJP pushed on to build also support across these groups. And so if we compare these figures with other parties, we see that not only the diversification strategy of the BJP is not new, but it's also, I mean, it has done it in the past, but it's also not specific to the BJP. So this chart, for example, on the left shows that the rise of non-Yadav OBC representation started before 2017. During actually a previous phase of BJP ascendancy in the late 90s and early 90s. But when the regional parties come to power, late 90s, early 2000, their representation somewhat declines, right? And it's this decline that the BJP sort of banked on in its mobilization. And you see how it takes off once the BJP takes over in 2017. But if you compare different parties, and this is the BSP and the SP, since the early 2000s, major parties in UP have been attempting to do the same, to expand their electoral base by providing representation to a greater diversity of groups. And the data shows that BSP and SP actually did it first in these recent elections. In 2007, the BSP attempted to shift its identity from a Bahujan party, a party for the lower caste majority, to a Sarvajan party, a party for the entire society, which was a shift in discourse meant to justify the induction within the party of a large number of upper caste candidates. The campaign was advertised as a Dalit Brahmin alliance, which was a misleading label because it hid the fact that the BSP had been providing representation across a wide array of groups before, particularly among the OBCs. Since the early 90s, backward classes have formed the bulk of the BSP's MLAs, only outweighed by the upper caste in 2007 and 2017. This was a strategy devised by Kanshiram pretty early on. Since the BSP as a Dalit party cannot get Dalit elected in general seats, it has to field candidates drawn from other groups in general seats. And how to select these candidates, not from within the organization being primarily composed of the local Dalit groups, but by co-opting individuals who belong to locally dominant group, therefore to powerful local backward classes, but also the upper caste, right? And in 2012, the Samajwadi Party followed suit, also by leading a campaign that was based on the promise of inclusion and representation beyond its core Yadav and Muslim base. And so the data shows that upper castes have always found good representation within the SP, particularly Rajputs, right? And we can see that the SP, despite having this reputation of an OBC party or a backward party, sees the share of OBC MLAs diminish over time as its performance actually improves. But if you look at these data at the Jati level, you see that you still have strong alignments between certain castes and these two parties. Of the 81 scheduled caste MLAs elected on BSP tickets between 2007 and 2017, 53 belong to the Jatav community, which is the core support group of the BSP. 93 of the 164 OBC SP MLAs elected since 2007 belong to the Yadav community, which is the core base of the SP. But that's not entirely dissimilar to the preferential distribution of tickets to upper caste candidates by the BJP. Therefore, there's a strong commonality of practice between these three parties. And as far as the BJP is concerned, caste-based representation gets skewed in favor of upper caste MLAs. Not in the same measure that in the past, but it remains vastly disproportionate to their demographic weight. But the skewed representation in favor of upper caste takes place in a different way also, which is that the tickets that are allotted to non-dominant groups are scattered across a large number of small castes. Beyond Yadav, Kurmis, and to a lesser extent Lords, most OBC groups that obtain representation within the BJP get 1 or 2 seats at the most, right? And since these groups do not form a homogeneous or even a politically coherent ensemble, the fragmentation of representation among OBCs within the BJP does not yield them or their representative the power and the influence that they hope to obtain once the election is over. You may remember that before the 2022 elections, 15 OBC leaders from the BJP, including 3 ministers, resigned, citing a frustration of not being listened to, heard, or not having the influence that they thought they deserved. That was an expression of that discontent. And so what we see is that the claim of inclusion that parties make, or the inclusive turn that parties do from 2007 onwards, does not translate into the dilution of the representation of the core group within these 3 parties. Some alignments do persist. And we see also that the greater representation of other groups or lower groups in the case of the BJP does not automatically translate into greater power or influence, not at least in the same measure. That is reflected in the composition of cabinets. These are every cabinet back to 2002, the winning party, of course, which shows that in the BJP still favors upper caste representation among the ministers, right? OBCs and intermediary castes represent 43 or 40% of all ministers, but they tend to be also very fragmented, right? There's also a hierarchy in terms of the portfolio that are distributed. Most OBC ministers will be a minister of state rather than a full cabinet minister, for example. So there are different ways where traditional hierarchies actually can be maintained within the government. And since all these backward class leaders must compete for power and positions within the party, there's very little caste solidarity across those groups, right? There are competitors within the BJP. And that contributes to the fact that backward class leaders and ministers have often been overruled within the UP government on matters that concern them most, like decisions on reservations or the refusal to conduct a caste census in UP. By comparison, BSP and SP have a smaller presence of their core support groups among the ministers and also favor upper caste representation within the government. But I've only talked about caste so far in a rather descriptive fashion.
Before you go to class and assets,
yeah.
You're saying that even though these proportions are similar now,
Yeah.
the upper castes are getting either the cabinet level positions more than the OBCs.
They are.
Or the OBCs are getting smaller ministries.
That's correct.
That's what's right.
Yeah.
The numbers are similar now, right? 40.4%, but the important ministries and the cabinet level appointments go mostly here.
That's correct.
Disproportionately here.
Yeah. There are other ways hierarchies can be maintained.
Okay.
So caste, of course, is only one way to measure the representative character of a state assembly. And perhaps the most significant transformation that has occurred among the political class in UP has been the transformation, the changing occupational profile of candidates and MLAs, and the increased centrality of wealth in candidate selections. So over the past 20 years, the number of candidates and MLAs who declare some form of business activity as their main occupation has risen sharply, while those declaring more conventional professions such as agriculture or a liberal profession like law have greatly diminished. My PhD thesis was about the rise of regional parties in UP and the transformation of politics and the transformation of UP's political class. And I documented how competitive pressures, transformations within regional parties led them to recruit their candidate from a rather homogeneous pool of individuals connected to local business networks, willing to invest vast sums of money into short and uncertain political careers. I found that while regional parties diversified their recruitment in terms of caste, they also selected candidates who shared important characteristics constitutive of what parties consider to be winnability criteria: money, name recognition, business network connections, family, reputation, muscle. And my main argument was that a focus on caste-based diversity as the main measure of the representative character of assembly is misleading and obfuscates the fact that on many other important sociological aspects, the political class of UP appears to be rather homogeneous and elitist, sociologically disconnected from most of the individuals who belong to the groups that they claim to represent. And so 2 measures of homogeneity in the political class of UP are occupation data and assets. This data is actually more sketchy because it primarily relies on self-declared information, which is contained in the affidavits. And this information is close to impossible or very hard to verify other than doing fieldwork. So I've spent much time between 2007 and 2012 to verify occupation data through fieldwork and interviews. And I found that the number of MLAs involved in business activities may actually, in fact, be fairly underestimated in the data. We know that politicians have many incentives to hide their actual sources of revenue, and they also have incentives to lie about their occupation. Businessmen who run for office become social workers once they get elected. I know personally several MLAs who declare social work as their profession, but whose spouse run local empires of petrol pumps and or brick kilns, empires. In my years of field work, I've encountered a number of lawyers, politicians who declare themselves to be lawyers, but actually own factories, run private schools, took participation in partners or friends' businesses. I even met a politician who introduced himself as an author, but whose campaign funds came from a factory exporting dog food to Thailand, which was owned by his father from Kanpur. So politicians have incentives to declare agriculture as their main occupation because farmers don't pay income tax. People in UP today are still laughing about the fact that when Amitabh Bachchan ran for office for Lok Sabha in 1984 in Allahabad, he declared agriculturist as a profession. And so many candidates also declare several occupations. These occupations are loosely defined, farmers or businessmen. But if you take them in aggregate, it provides useful information or indication about at least what candidates are willing to declare. And so this is something that has been documented in the past by scholars like Paul Browse, by Christian Meyer, more recently by Jasmine Zerenini. Most representatives in the past, most politicians in the past, were either declaring agriculture or law as a profession. Lawyers today have almost all but disappeared, and candidates, the share of candidates declaring agriculture as their main or only profession went down to 28% in 2012, to 11% in 2016, and up to 16% in 2022. But on the other hand, the share of MLAs declaring some form of business has gone up tremendously, from 8% in the 80s to nearly half in the 2000s. And in 2017 and 2022, they make respectively 47.5% and 54.6% of all BJP's MLAs, right? But as you can see, it's distributed across parties, right? This is not something that is specific to the party that actually wins. It's specific, it cuts across party affiliations. And so these labels, of course, cover a great diversity of possible situations, but the fieldwork that I've conducted in UP between 2007, 2012, and all the subsequent visits that I've made ever since, and the work of other scholars like Milan Vaishnav shows that politicians are often involved in economic sectors like construction, property dealing, distribution, contracting, transport companies, cold storages. Very few, almost none, are white-collar professionals. Most of them belong to professions that share a few important characteristics. There are fast-growing, rent-seeking sectors of the economy. They are cash-rich. They are close to the state, dependent on the state for licenses, for authorizations, for contracts. They are not traditionally tied to specific caste groups, right? There's not a caste of, real estate developer, for example, right? Everyone can, it's a form of profession everyone can invest in, provided that they have the resources. And there are also the sectors of economic activity that tend to be the most criminalized. And so if you take all these characteristics together, they provide strong incentives for individual businessmen to get involved into politics, because it becomes a very powerful way to pursue some form of private interest. It connects you, it gives you party connections, it makes you close to the local administrations. Power and influence is obviously useful to deal also with competition. It puts the police on your side, which is very useful when you run shady businesses. And so there's a system of incentives that create a class of individuals who are willing to get into politics and who also have the resources to do so, and who tend to check most of the boxes that what candidates think makes a good candidate, right? And so the BJP's candidate profile looks very similar to the profile of the BSP and SP candidates in previous elections. And actually, sometimes they are literally the same people, because we know that the BJP today is far more inclined to poach MLAs and politicians from other parties than it used to in the past.
What's
So,
the declared profession of the Chief Minister of the country?
agriculturist and monk.
And monk.
Yeah.
And Mayawati?
Social worker.
Social worker.
Yeah.
And Akhilesh?
Agriculture and politics. And so, I did a case study on the Samajwadi Party some time ago, and I explained how the rise of businessmen politicians proceeds from the growing integration of local business and political networks, how the growth of cash-rich, rent-seeking sectors close to the state produce a pool of potential candidates most parties recruit their candidates from, leading to the homogenizations of UP's political class on a class basis rather than on a caste basis. And this provides the background for the criminalization of politics that Milan Vaishnav talks about. In fact, my argument is that being criminal, being a gunda, is not an occupation. It's just a function of how you run your business, right? And so over the last two elections, I find that the BJP has adopted the methods of recruitment of its adversaries. It applies the same winnability criteria in the search of its candidates. And that's a significant change for the BJP, because we know that it used to recruit most of its candidates from its extended organizations, BJP local branch members, RSS pracharaks, individuals who had a history of association with the BJP or some of its affiliated organizations. Today, we still find a lot of pracharaks among the BJP MLAs, but they tend to be also in business, which was not necessarily the case before, because it's necessary to sustain a political career. So the share of businessmen among BJP MLAs is high because that's how they are recruited. They have the resource, the connections, the incentives, to run for office. But also because conventional BJP politicians are also taking to business in order to sustain their careers. One of the significant developments that happened after 2017 was there was a crackdown on crime by the government, part of a strong law and order campaign. It was a cleaning operation that created a void in the space of criminality that exists in UP through police pressures, arrests, and counter killings. But this void was soon filled by individuals, many of them belonging to the Hindu militia of the chief minister himself, the Hindu Yuva Vahini, which remarkably transformed itself, the moment they came to power, transformed itself from a Hindu militant outfit into a conventional UP Gunda business organization. And so data on assets, and I will go quickly on that, shows how much richer candidates today are compared to the past. Even if you adjust for inflation, these are extraordinary numbers. Consider that the average BJP candidate declared, and we know that it's under-declared, but declared 7.5 crore of personal assets in 2022 against 62 lakhs in 15 years ago. And you can see how that cuts across political party. This is not specific to any political party. It's characteristic of the political class across party, including small parties. The one way small parties survive, like the RLD, it's because some of their candidates are among the richest candidates. It cuts across caste groups. You see that upper caste MLAs tend to be much richer than the others, but even members of groups that are underprivileged, like SCs or Muslims, their representatives are also extraordinarily rich, right? And then it goes on. And so, okay, so even if one accepts that at face value on the basis of caste, UP's political class is more diverse today than it used to be 15 or 20 years ago, there are other reasons to believe that this kind of diversity does not necessarily translate into substantive gains for the groups that obtain such kind of representation. One of reason is the elite profile of the representative, right? They may not be exactly representative of the communities they belong to, but another set of reasons comes from the fact that over the years, the role or importance of elected representatives has greatly diminished. I only mention a few factors that lead me to make this observation, but incumbency data reveals that the career of most politicians in UP is very short. Most MLAs do not serve more than a term, and they disappear after their first elections. Either they're booted out by voters or they are kicked out by their own party. In the current assembly, which has 403 members, there are only 87 legislators who have been elected more than twice. Many of them have been appointed ministers, which leaves very few experienced MLAs to actually do legislative work. They form what I call the stable political class, a class of professional politicians who endures, those who win their seat when their party loses their election, for instance. These are the real professionals of politics, and there are just very, very few of them. And historical data shows that this is a constant in UP's political life. You can go as far back to the 1950s. Elections have always been extraordinarily competitive for individuals. They have to compete within and between parties. They have to resist all kinds of competitive pressures in order to survive in politics. And so UP and the rest of India actually has strong incumbency disadvantage. There's a rapid turnover of the politicians, which is a strong measure of how extraordinarily concentrated political power has always been in UP, even in phases of reconfiguration of the party system or in phase of ascension of new parties. So parties that externalize the business of winning seats to local entrepreneurs who invest in politics to further some private interest are also parties that concentrate power greatly within themselves. That's the third observation, that as political parties in UP have become more diverse, they have also become more and more centralized and internally authoritarian as organizations. That includes the BJP, which has been completely transformed from a party of local notables, which grew out of municipal elections upward. It's been transformed into an extraordinary electoral machine at the service of the party leadership. The professionalization of politics, the recourse to consultants, the recourse to private firms, all that also enhances the power of the party's high command and contributes to sideline elected representatives who find that they actually don't have a lot of work to do other than constituency service or rent-seeking activities that are necessary to survive in politics. And so these developments bear several important implications with regard to the democratic functioning of the state and for our understanding of the role of caste in politics. One, there is a disconnect between political representation and the individuals who are meant to embody that representation. There's a constant turnover, right? So the caste label matters, but the individuals actually do not. Representation does not only occur through elected representatives, right? Voters may feel represented by what a party stands for, by the promises that it makes. Second, the short career in the competitiveness of elections provides very little incentives to MLAs to actually learn the job of parliamentarian. They complain to be sidelined, they have no meaningful work to perform in the state assembly. Third, the rising cost of entry into politics, the general competitiveness of elections. There's a difficult entry and there's a high probability of early exit. And the system of incentives offered by parties to their candidates has a strong filtering effect on who gets to run for office in the first place. And that favors the representation of local strongmen with business connections. And the combinations of all these factors also create systemic incentives for all kinds of predatory behavior. And fourth, these inclusive strategies still rely on the exclusion of some other. The BJP's brand of inclusion excludes Muslims entirely. It also excludes women across political parties. No party actually has any record of giving fair representation to women. They barely make 10% of all candidates. As far as caste in politics is concerned, the importance of, or the role of caste in politics gets redefined in at least two important ways. Caste does not matter as much as it did in the past as a vehicle for transversal or horizontal mobilization. It matters as a criterion among others in the selection of candidates and as a unit measure for inclusion and diversity within parties and within the assembly. But it is disconnected from social movements that used to be the core and the base of collective caste aspirations back in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. At the end of the day, diversity is achieved through the aggregation of candidates that are selected otherwise on elitist criteria. Second implication, this idea of a general inclusion or equal treatment of all replaces an axis of political division that used to oppose upper caste and backward classes. An axis of division that had also not just a caste, but also a class angle. Support from backward classes is built through multiple strategies that include caste, but also religion, nationalism, welfarism, strongman politics. As a result, the BJP can pass legislations that favors its traditional core base, like the 10% reservation for general category, for example, without generating or suffering from too much of a backlash, right? Because the reason why a lot of backward voters vote for the BJP actually don't have a lot to do, or not only have to do with caste. And that helps the BJP to fit caste and caste-based mobilization within the ambit of a larger political discourse organized around Hindutva and the redefinition of the role of the state, right? A party like the BJP means different things to different voters. And so, to conclude, it's true that the BJP today in some ways is more diverse than it used to be, right? Particularly within its organization. Its electoral base is much more diverse than it used to be. And it includes every segment of the population except Muslims. But the fact that this increased diversity takes place and at the same time of an unprecedented process of power concentration within parties, and through the formation of a political class that is quite homogeneous and very elitist, should make us think about the meaning of descriptive representation, or should make us think about the substantive or emancipatory potential of that kind of inclusion. So political representation in UP has always been, by and large, skewed in favor of the elites. My argument is to say that the fact of elitism remains, but the forms and composition of who belongs to these elites changes over time. The rise of regional parties in the 2000s has contributed to create a political class that is embedded in local business network because it's a reflection of larger transformation occurring in UP. And what I find interesting, and which I think is worth having a conversation of, is the fact that the rise of the BJP does not change that trajectory. In fact, it accentuates it further by even pouring even more resources into the electoral process and calling it inclusion at the same time. Thank you.
Here is perhaps a summary of your argument that there is a huge diversification in terms of caste, but increasing concentration in terms of wealth and income, and increasing centralization of power within the party.
Correct.
So diversification or the idea of inclusion is only about caste, but there are two other tendencies simultaneously operating: concentration of wealth and income, and concentration of power within political parties. All right, so now we turn to Thibaut Marces for his 10 minutes of commentary. Thibaut has been working in UP for many years now, and his dissertation was also on a district in UP, which with the focus on local politics.
Thank you, Ashu, for the invitation, and thanks, Gilles, for a wonderful presentation and a great paper, which I really enjoyed reading. I have a lot of comments and questions for you, and I was trying to think about how to organize all of this yesterday, and there's like three main points I wanted to bring up for discussion. The first one has to do with the structure of political parties specifically. The second has more to do with caste and caste narratives in contemporary UP politics. And the third one is more about party system institutionalization and the future of UP politics. I mean, we're political scientists, so we're not really in the business of making predictions, but to the extent that we see patterns emerge, how sustainable are they? So let me just start by saying that I like this sort of this insight that, you know, in a way, we've seen, since 2017, the election, the victory of the BJP in 2017 was seen as a watershed moment, right? Much like Mayawati winning in 2007 was, right? So it's been seen as a very significant event, and it is in many ways, given, if only because of its scope, right? I mean, the BJP won by an absolute landslide in 2017 and was re-elected earlier this year with a slightly smaller majority, but still very significant. But basically what you're telling us is that, we see those changes in discourse, we see these changes in winning coalitions, but in a way, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it stays the same. Like looking specifically at the political elite in Uttar Pradesh, there's
bring in le guépard.
That's actually a quote from a beautiful movie on 19th century Italian politics, I think. Yeah, Sicilian politics. And I think this is what is really striking here. You would think that there's been a lot of changes in the way parties behave, the way they strategize, the way they organize campaigns, and it seems that the BJP has not fundamentally changed the way parties interact with candidates at the local level and citizens, perhaps. The caste arithmetic weighs very, very heavily. This is something that Prashant Jha noticed in 2017, and I'm going to talk about that book again. What I thought was also really interesting and also depressing in a way is what you were mentioning towards the end of your presentation, that party leaders retain a lot of discretion in the award of tickets, and not, in fact, a lot of MLAs are able to rerun, right? So there's a loss of knowledge within the assembly, and not to mention the fact that MLAs themselves are not really involved in the preparation of in legislative work per se. But I'll come back to this when we talk about the institutionalization of the party system. So the first comment I wanted to make, a broader comment I wanted to make, was on this relationship between party leaders and local party elites. This is what I found was really interesting in your paper. I think this focus on the sociology of local party elites is really, really interesting, and it sort of, it does overlap with a lot of my own findings. And when I did field work in UP several years ago, there is a tendency for party elites, for party leaders, I should say, at the state level, to really choose powerful, strong men. Wealthy individuals at the local level who will be able to, generate enough cash to run a campaign. And that's what I think is. I mean, you sort of hinted at that in the paper, but I had more questions for you on this, because you've showed us a lot of data on the increasing individual wealth of those candidates, right? And my first thought was like, well, I mean, this money must be sent one way or another, and I know that this is also because the cost of elections has increased dramatically in recent years. I mean, elections in India have always been very expensive, but like they have increased very, very significantly. And so this, says that somehow, party leaders and local party elites believe that the distribution of cash will win them votes. Now, we know that there's a lot of work on this, and I'm thinking about Lisa Bjorkman's work in Mumbai, and Simon Chochar's work as well in Mumbai, tells us that voters are not really interested in the cash itself, but they may be much more receptive to the performative act of spending money. But it seems that the parties are still thinking in terms of cash needs. Where do we get the cash? And so the question that I had for you was, and something that I think is not very well researched in the Indian context, is the sort of relative balance of power between party leaders and those local party elites. When I mention local party elites, I mean MLAs who or even bloc pramukhs, like local leaders at the district level. Because you're sort of telling us that parties in India, I mean in UP specifically, are very centralized. They're very authoritarian. They're not very institutionalized, right? So rules tend to float around, they change. They're not really enforced. These parties are not very, very disciplined. We know all of that. But my sense was always that the parties were at the end of the day fairly weak in their ability to sort of deploy resources, mobilize resources, and run campaigns. So I was wondering if you could add maybe a little more on this, what you think the balance of power, the relative balance of power was between those members of the local party elite and party leaders at the national level, knowing that, and I will talk about this again, that a lot of you talked about the BJP sort of now embracing the strategy that has been used and used in the past by other parties, the PSP and the SP, of co-optation, right? Yeah. So that's not always the case. There are instances in which the BJP does in fact recruit social workers or people who have ties to the Sangh, who are not very wealthy, but are very ideologically committed, right? But the BJP increasingly appears to be embracing that strategy of co-optation. So and to me, these individuals at the local level have a lot of leverage in a way, because they can really, they also go with the flow to some extent. They know which party is probably more likely to win to some extent, but I do think they have still a lot of leverage.
Thibault, is the following formulation of what you're saying right? Can the party leadership knock out the very influential and the very rich local party leaders? That's the question you're asking.
That's the question, and I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, in my personal experience, I did my research in central UP in what is known as Awadh, and in those, there's a lot of there's a lot of very powerful local politicians who also run huge businesses, are very, very wealthy, who have gone from, being INC, Congress MLAs, or even MPs in the past. I'm thinking there's one guy in Wanda, I think his name is Brij Bhushan Singh, who's a Dabangwala. He's a very, very powerful local leader, and he's done, he's a Thakur by caste. So you would think he's a natural candidate for the BJP, but he was with the BSP for a very long time. And I think before that, he was with the Congress as well. He's now with the BJP. So these people have the ability to some extent to chase tickets and get them. But I acknowledge that it may not necessarily be the case everywhere. Yeah. So that's something that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss. The second comment is on caste and caste narratives, and you talked a little bit about this. I thought this was really interesting in the paper. It's this idea that we have. So yes, the BJP has sort of, and I'm thinking of the book of Prashant Jha's book, how the BJP Wins, which came out, I think, in 2017, just a few months after the election, which is a great book. I highly recommend this book. Jha is actually a journalist, I think, by training.
Now he's the Washington correspondent of the
Hindustan Times. And that book was really good at showing, I think he uses the term social engineering, how the BJP basically looks at the caste, the caste breakup at the local level and sort of like organizes the award of tickets on that basis, and how in the end this paid off.
He's also my editor at HT.
There you go. So, the book is really, really great to sort of understand this sort of like form of social engineering. Now, the question is, and he had this, I think he had a chapter on how the BJP now is very good at crafting individual narratives for specific caste groups within the broader, caste, like take the example of the scheduled caste, right? So yes, the BSP is usually associated with the Jatas, with the Chamat, right? So, and has been historically associated with that specific subgroup. Well, the BJP appears to have actually tried to work with smaller SC groups by sort of crafting a narrative of political sort of like assertion, dignity, and emphasizing in the process the fact that Dalits have historically been at odds with Muslims, that they have nothing to do with Muslims and really should, join the great Hindu family, right? And so what I was gonna ask you, Gilles, is how much of that is really, you sort of said that yes, representation matters, but nominations of individual candidates do not seem to matter all that much anymore. Which would go against the argument made by Kanchan Chandra 15 years ago on the fact that voters look for the leadership. They don't necessarily look for the party label, but they look for their own co-ethnics among the party leadership and the candidates, right? So how much of that narrative of Hindutva is really sort of like seeping all the way down to, and this goes a little bit beyond your discussion and study of local elites, because I'm really thinking about what voters really think, right? And how much are we likely to see sort of a return perhaps to traditional caste narratives, right? So like groups sort of like coalescing and sort of focusing much more on distributive outcomes and how much they can actually extract from the state. And the last comment, I'm just looking at the time. 2 minutes. And the last comment I had for you is really the sustainability of this new coalition, right? So 2017 watershed election, 2022, we see for the first time in a very long time in UP, the incumbent being actually reelected. That's a big deal. How much of this is really, I study party system institutionalization and I teach it now. And I think of, when I teach this class on party systems, parties and party systems, I teach my students, Lipset and Rokan and the freezing of party systems in Europe in the 20th century. Are we likely to see something, similar in UP? Like we seem to have an emerging, two-party system, assuming that the BSP is more or less spent. The BSP did very, very poorly, I think, in March of this year. The Congress did only marginally better, maybe, I don't know how many seats. I think they went from 7
only 2.5% of vote.
What is it?
Only 2.5%.
So we seem to have two, major players.
Yeah.
So how likely is this to endure? I mean, again, we're not in the business of making predictions, but especially if you look at the neighboring state of Bihar, where a lot of subgroups have now, you have, the party system in Bihar is much more fragmented, but there's a lot of the subgroups that were able to assert themselves continue to be very relevant in contemporary Bihari politics. So, and I think that's about it. I had a few other comments which I can raise later after everyone has spoken.
Can we use about the second point that you were making? Can we use this category called vertical mobilization, conceptual differentiation, vertical mobilization and horizontal mobilization? Going back to the early literature on caste politics, where basically the claim was that you could mobilize lower castes under the leadership of upper castes, that would be vertical mobilization, or you could mobilize lower castes as lower castes, which was horizontal mobilization, which is what emerged in South India.
Yeah.
Whereas in the 50s and 60s and maybe until the 70s, the mobilization of lower castes in much of North India was vertical. But South India had broken through and was doing horizontal mobilization. Now, that mandal politics in the 1990s was about horizontal mobilization, right? Are you suggesting that the BJP kind of politics now, this is to return to add something to the second point that Thibaut raised? Are you saying that the BJP's inclusion of lower castes under its umbrella is yet another example of vertical mobilization? So that's just to add to what Thibaut said.
Yeah, I think that would be right, because caste-based mobilization is just, one aspect, it's one way, one form of, how the BJP mobilizes, right? The strength of the BJP is that it's holding multiple discourses at the same time, and people can sort of cherry pick which discourse they like to justify their vote for the BJP, right? So the language of caste inclusion is one of them, but obviously, religious or ethnic nationalism is definitely another one, or the discourse around the transformation of welfareism and redistribution. What is interesting is that the BJP's machinery enables it to do the kind of individual targeting of voters, which no other parties has ever been able to do in India before, which enables it to, build this almost personal association between individuals and party leaders, right? This is part of the populist regime. This is part of the personalization of politics, the projection of leadership, but also the redefinition of welfare regime into individual targeting distribution rather than targeting large groups or using the big machinery of the state to sort of balance, the interests of different groups. What I find is that electoral politics seems to be more detached from its social basis than it used to be, right? These lower OBCs are not part of a large backward movement pushing collectively for representation. This is a large, there's a group of diverse groups that are competing against one another for power and influence inside the BJP. And the BJP and its upper caste cadres play on that internal competition to sort of prevent those horizontal solidarities from emerging. Also, these strategies are by definition localized. The BJP does not distribute tickets for the sake of having diversity, but because the distribution of tickets makes sense at the level of each constituency. There are only a handful of constituencies where lower OBCs actually represent a sizable chunk of voters. And this is where the BJP is giving them tickets, right? And so there's a process of localization of electoral politics and that also prevents the forming of these horizontal forms of mobilization. So there's a diversification of discourse, there's a micro-targeting of voters, there's a transformation of distribution regime that basically shift collective benefits to individual benefits. And all this in the name of integration and inclusion within the large family, which is defined in the terms of Hindutva.
See, here is the problem with there's tension in the argument. Let's point out the tension. Mm-hmm. You cannot have a strategy emphasizing dignity of lower castes and a strategy which says these can't be the same. The strategy that emphasizes the dignity of lower castes and achievement or pursuit of the dignity through greater representation in seats of power, right? That was the South Indian model. That's how it emerged. Yeah. It's very hard to merge it into a Hindu nationalist model, right? Where the emphasis is on Hinduness, not on the caste dignity. Because the very idea of caste dignity was that the Hindu structure, the hierarchical Hindu structure, was fundamentally opposed to lower castes living a life of dignity. Right? Mm. So when Tamil Nadu looks at BJP, it says there is no fit between the kind of politics we've had since 19 teens between that and what Hindu nationalists are trying to achieve. You can't play that game easily in Tamil Nadu or in Kerala. Yeah. It'll go up by 2%, 3%. You can't easily play that game. Because fundamentally, caste politics is opposed to the idea of Hindutva. Fundamentally. Now, what kind of marriage BJP is trying to achieve? Can you say something about how is it trying to marry these two? How is it getting low caste into its fold? Through just labhar, through the distribution of welfare, or through some other kind of consciousness that is cultivating?
Communalism. Hatred of Muslim, or the nurturing of hatred towards Muslim. That's one. Inclusion, through redistribution and welfare. That's another. But also with a transformation of Hindutva discourse itself, which they've tried very hard to make themselves more compatible with non-traditional upper caste idioms. So Badri Narain has written about this, about how local RSS, sort of provide patronage to religious events or festivals within particular group that are specific to them. Or explain that your local deity is actually, it's part of a larger pantheon of Hindu deities, right? And so there's a co-optation of local forms of religious practice, which are widespread, across groups, not just, that within the ambit of. So they've made Hindutva more palatable, right? In a way, more compatible with the assertion of. Caste assertion of caste identity. It's
the logic would be as follows, and I'll keep quiet after this because I'm speaking too much. If you successfully replace Brahmin as the other or upper caste as the other with Muslim as the other, if you successfully replace this idea of who's the other to the lower caste, you won the battle.
They've done that to a large extent, yeah.
You've really won the battle. There were two master narratives in Indian politics historically, since the 19 teens. One is the lower caste dignity argument was always against the upper caste. Always, not against the Muslim, always against the upper caste. Whereas Hindutva argument was always against the Muslim and the man. So if they have replaced that
that's
with the lower caste, it is a very big victory. Is it for the time being, or you think it's a much more permanent victory?
So your description is exactly right. It's precisely what has happened. And it creates a situation which is quite fascinating because it basically, creates a space for the deployment of power and influence for the upper caste that's probably unprecedented, right? Brahmins, Thakurs, and their relations with the state, for example, has never been so, so high or so intense or so. Also beneficial to them. They're getting the policies they want, right? Including on the basis of caste, like can you imagine a party able to draw a lot of votes from backward groups and yet at the same time succeed in creating a quota for general category, right? So alignments between voters and parties are not defined by one variable alone, but by a variety of registers. And the strength of the BJP, again, is the ability to connect with voters through multiple registers. And that has the effect of diluting those old structuring axis of political division that used to divide backwards from forward casts, right? And that obviously that's a language that is absent from the BJP narrative. But it was also, but it's been diluted before the BJP rose by the SP and the BSP themselves, who also needed votes from upper caste voters and who also provided them with representation. The BSP used to be virulently anti-Brahmin. They had slogans, right? That she slapped with chappals,
Yes.
figurative representation of Brahmins on stage, and all that disappeared, right? So that also prepared the ground for the kind of politics that the BJP does today.
Let's open up. Huh? Let's take more questions and then you can.
On the communers on this issue, I think what they have done, so yes, they've used the communal card very effectively, but they've also made that, made talking to Muslims by other parties toxic. This is what is really fascinating now. It's like, especially in 2017, I think was also the case. When Muslims in UP and over India are lagging behind, along several human development indicators. Parties are not in a position to really reach out effectively to them because the BJP will be like, oh look, they're just doing a minority appeasement one again.
One enduring political reality, at least of UP, but it could be extended to other states also, not all states, was that without getting substantial Muslim vote, you could not come to power. 20% of UP is Muslim. To reduce 20% of the population, of the electorate, into irrelevance required a certain kind of skill that BJP has demonstrated, which was quite unexpected.
Yeah.
How do you reduce 20% of the electorate into irrelevance?
Because Muslim votes are divided.
Also,
They were in 2017 and they were again in 2022.
Yeah.
Not,
So,
Quite equally
not
divided,
to
like a fair
not-
chunk of,
not to the same extent.
so let's open up. Let's go. Yeah. What are the questions, comments? Where do we turn on the mics? There? Oh, okay. Whoever asks, please turn on the mic. 0 is off and 1 is on. Who'd like?
So just, if it is this replacement of this master narrative, right, is that basically we don't, this is, I think, just a really interesting question, which is, of course, the Vinay Sitapati book that, we all kind of know about a little bit, which is, are Dalits kind of within the Hindu fold? Are they happily within the Hindu fold? What are the conditions for their inclusion within this kind of fold? And is this a kind of all India pattern, or what are the kind of fissures and variations we may see subnationally? And so to me, these are just questions that I've been kind of stoked by for a while, and I would just love your thoughts on that. I mean, to what because, on the other hand, right, it's I think that's the challenge for us as political scientists, is both, as Thibault was saying, is that we're not in the business of making predictions, but we also have the benefit of counterfactuals, right, and of historical possibilities that maybe, because the present is so overwhelming, we lose sight of. But, you can well imagine that there could be an alliance between Dalits and Muslims around, for instance, diet and fighting cow slaughter bans, or and so when I look at something, and again, I know that we are here in UP politics, but as someone who's kind of tried to, I always think of UP politics in juxtaposition because of the nature of my work in politics to, for instance, Kerala, which is another 20% Muslim state, right? And so I'm just kind of struck by both the kind of singularity and uniqueness of UP politics, but is there a kind of possible other world when we kind of get out of UP? But this broader question of what is the relationship between Dalits and upper castes, is super exciting, I think.
It's a great
to talk
question.
about.
And it's one of the one of the remarkable achievements of the BJP is to have succeeded in increasing support across Dalits, in a very significant ways. And it's been doing so repeatedly, in recent elections, in national elections, in state elections, and across North India, not just in UP. Despite the fact that the rise of the BJP in the same state has also led to a resurgence of upper caste assertion, which has translated into a lot of violence against Dalits. So there are these huge contradictions here that we don't really know how to grapple with.
So we know nationally in 2014 elections, 25% of Dalits voted for BJP, and in the 2019 elections, every third Dalit voted for BJP.
Yeah,
33%. In UP,
about 40%.
40% of Dalits voted for BJP.
National election, yeah, it's very significant. And the imposition of a communal narrative as a master narrative, I think, to an extent, trumps this contradiction. But there's no reason to believe that it's necessarily going to endure, right? Because there's always a change of circumstances that can lead to transformation. But to have a Dalit and Muslim alliance, you need to have actors who can actually create that alliance, and they just don't exist. Who are the prominent Dalit BJP politicians? Can't name one, or can't name a few, who are the prominent, Muslim politicians in UP? Azam Khan, not exactly a poster boy for, progressive politics or those kinds of alliance. I have data on caste among Muslim politicians, and 3/4 of Muslim politicians in UP over the past 20 years belong to upper caste Muslims, which make maybe 20% of the whole Muslim population, right, in this state. So that's the problem, is that you don't have the actors. Dalits are completely scattered. They have, ground organizations, but they don't really occupy, the ground, the political ground. The Bhim Army, for example, is not interested in creating, a Dalit Muslim alliance. They're trying, but it's not generating a lot of results. And no, it does not translate into results that can be used for a political project or for political gains. And so I think it's
when the Dalit votes for the BJP, 40%, I'm sure it's not one impulse, but what are they thinking of when they're voting for BJP? What do we know from research? Why are they voting for BJP?
We know very little.
Huh?
We know from research.
We don't know.
We know very little, because there's very little data that actually, ask those questions, right? We know, generally speaking, that, there's not one type of determinant of electoral behavior that predominate over the others, right? And so for certain Dalits in certain localities, it's going to be welfare. For others, it's going to be Hindutva, or is it going to be a combination of the two? It can also be local configuration, right? If local Dalits have been, co-opted by certain group have been co-opted by the BSP, you will have, a polarization that takes place, which another party can benefit in. There's a whole register of nationalism, which is also which does not leave Dalit unaffected, and so I don't think there's one simple answer to that question. And the reality is that we don't have the instruments of the data to actually measure that. No, we don't.
But also one on the issue of governance, as they say. I spoke to a school friend of mine just before the election, because so much was going on. He's right in the heart of UP, has always been, and I asked him what's going on and what will happen. And he said Yogi will win because he is a good administrator and his integrity and honesty is beyond doubt. So the overarching theme of good governance, which has helped, I think, in winning these elections, can actually, counter these divisive and polarizing forces. Now, if you see a recent incident, you excluded the Muslims and you excluded the women, more or less, and you're talking about good governance, and immediately after the elections, 2 Dalit women are raped by 6 men who are not Muslims, I think.
Yeah.
Upper caste Hindu. So, with this narrative, you have to see what's happening on the ground as well.
Yeah.
And whether 5 years from now, people will still buy your, narrative of good governance.
So it's a very good question. And to answer it, I think we need to unpack the meaning of that word governance, which is always very loosely defined, and which, in the case of UP, is very often used as a euphemism for, either transformation of the welfare regime or strongman politics. So good governance is basically a fig leaf cover for the authoritarian turn that state politics has taken in UP. Good governance is a euphemism for being tough on crime, using methods that are hardly compatible with democratic norms and democratic systems. The encounters, the vigilantism, the state vigilantism that has developed greatly in UP since 2017. And so so we need to complicate a little bit, what good governance means. When people outside UP refer to the UP model of governance, and we had a discussion in Delhi about this, they're not. They're not referring to his qualities as an administrator. They're referring to bulldozers, and those bulldozers are used predominantly against opponents, dissenters, protesters, citizens, and Muslims to a very large extent, right? And so the UP model of governance is a way, is a euphemistic expression for the communalizations of the state and state policy.
Gilles, thank you for this, and also somebody who's used the electoral data a lot for the great public good. I had 2.
Can you speak into the
Sure.
microphone and message
Sure. Will be recorded. I had 2 questions and then maybe a question and a comment. The first question is sort of on, and I realize this is a talk about UP, but like Perna, I was curious about the comparative aspect, right? So part of the underlying argument here is that because of the changing nature of the Indian economy and who holds capital in the Indian economy, the type of representative in UP is changing, right? So would that also not be true for Indian elections more broadly? And I don't know if you can speak to that or not with the data, with the work that you have done. It sounds like you can speak to that with the data, but I don't know if you can speak to that with the work that you've done. So do we see this increasing homogenization of the political class in other states and MLAs in other places? Because surely if this is about the transformation of the Indian economy, this has been going on in places other than UP, especially places that are more vibrant economically than, like, I'm thinking like Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and things like that. 2, I'm actually curious about assets of Muslims, and this is going to come to my maybe provocative comment. Assets of Muslims and how rich Muslim candidates are. And there's one thing that was striking in the paper was that the 2 parties who have the poorest candidates are also the 2 parties that are least successful, the Congress and the BSP. And those can't be unrelated, right? That if you are attracting poor candidates, you are less likely to win, right? And then the sort of third comment / maybe provocative statement is maybe this whole master narrative is sort of epiphenomenal, right? Like you get power and then you come up with narratives to justify how you came to power later, right? And you come up with narratives to rule. And basically what the BJP has done is got a bunch of rich people together who can actually get into power. And then we have a narrative of communalism. And the reason that you've sort of excluded Muslims is because they're poor. and it's Muslims' economic exclusion that is leading to political exclusion, rather than some sort of master narrative about why the coalitions that the BJP is building.
No, thank you. Great questions. So on the changing nature of the economy, that's exactly the argument that I make. And so this is going into, this is a book project that I'm working on right now. I've sort of put different aspects into paper form for this presentation, but there is a chapter on sub-regional variations, which I've not mentioned at all here, within UP, which shows that the regions where the economy has transformed the most are the regions precisely where you find more of these wealthier, strongmen, wealthier, business-grounded or business-embedded politicians.
For example, Western UP.
So Western UP, some parts of Awad, in and around Lucknow, but with great disparities. And these are also the sub-regions that have seen the more churning in terms of representation patterns, right? In Rohilkhand, there's been a rise of Muslim representation. In Western UP, it's a free-for-all competition between every group who are all invested in some form of business activities. But in the Northeast or Eastern UP, the least developed, the more stagnating or declining, economically speaking, part of the state, representation patterns are actually very stable and favor traditional elites. In fact, something that Christophe wrote about the silent revolution, what I find is that the silent revolution did not take place uniformly everywhere. Upper caste representation has never been challenged in the Northeast, right? In the Northeast or in Awadh. If you look at caste-based strongholds, constituencies that keep electing someone who belongs to the same caste over time, most of these, first, there are few of these strongholds, most of them are Rajputs, and all of them are either in the Northeast or in Awadh, right? And so the causal factor, for these variations has a lot to do with.
By Northeast, you mean Varanasi and above?
Yeah, above. Yes,
Varanasi and above.
that's right. So from Ghazipur to Gorakhpur and that, in that area. And so there is a very clear link, between uneven economic development and the kind of churning that translates into politics, right? On the assets of Muslims, so the fact that Muslims tend to be wealthy is a measure of selection biases from political parties rather than a commentary on Muslims communities themselves, right? They tend to be upper caste Muslim, they tend to be wealthy, they tend to belong to prestigious families, and so there is no dearth of individual Muslims who actually have the resources to get into politics. Until 2012, Muslims obtained a proportional representation in the assembly for the first time ever. 18% of the population, they had 17% of the seats, right? But that's also because there was a pool of Muslim candidates who had the resources to get SP and BSP tickets, basically. Now, the exclusion of the BJP is complete, is deliberate, and is meant to be a signal of exclusion, like the public sphere that belongs to the majority, that belongs to Hindus. Whenever I'm in discussion in panels or when I have these, interviews with BJP politicians and, or whenever they are asked these questions, publicly, what about communalism? The standard answer is always the same. Muslims can be beneficiaries of our social programs like everyone else, but they don't have a vocation of, joining our party. They don't have a vocation of becoming politicians, right? So we don't want to exclude them completely from, welfare redistribution, but the public sphere belongs to us. And that's the purpose of vigilantism, right? It's claiming ownership and dominance over the public sphere through violent actions and pressures. Right? And it's also a convenient way to send a strong message of where the BJP stands with regard to Muslims' participation in public life, right? So I don't think it has anything to do with wealth among the community. And then on the master narrative becoming epiphenomenal, I completely agree, because something that's quite irritating about political commentary in India is that it always suits the fact after the facts, right? Success explains success. Why did the BJP did this, and they had a massive victory, therefore everything they did must have caused that victory to happen. And so explaining success by success, basically, and explaining defeat by defeat for the Congress Party or the BSP, and that's obvious. So what I'm trying to do here is to show that there is a master narrative about inclusion. It has many aspects. Caste is one aspect of it, but religion is another. Communalism, of course, is a strong drive to build this imagined community of Hindus, right? And what I'm trying to do is to show that if you look at empirical, evidence, you can see that this master narrative actually has a lot of holes. Because even the caste diversity that has been achieved by the BJP and other parties has strong limitations, right? You still have hierarchies that are maintained. You still have this, these hierarchies find a way to sort of, resurface. And so that leads me to think that those master narratives may be dominating now, but they're not necessarily, they relate to a reality that is necessarily more complicated, more complex, and more fluid and more transient as well. And so I don't do prediction, except to usually say that I'm quite pessimist about, the way, political developments happen, in India or in UP and elsewhere. But I'm quite confident that, these two also shall pass, right? And new forms of politics will emerge. And I find also in a lot of political commentary, a lot of there's a kind of a shock and awe effect of BJP dominance, right? It looks so powerful, so their strategy seems to be so effective. The way they neutralize their opponents and the way they concentrate resources, the way they dominate the public sphere, the way it creates this shock and awe impression that, there is no possible alternative. I remember that, and Ashoka can tell us, but, there was a similar shock and awe quality, to Indira Gandhi's rule until she was booted out of office, right? And
that 10 states are still non-BJP states out of 28.
Yeah.
10 out of 28 are still non-BJP. In that shock and awe analysis, people forget that 10 are not run by BJP.
Remember how elections are won through the mobilizations of, well, they're never small numbers because it's UP, but in percentage terms, right? So the BJP wins an election with 6% of the votes in 2017. It's 36% of the 55% or the 60% of voters who actually voted. So it's not only is it far from being a majority of voters, but it's far from being a majority of voters who actually express their vote. And turnout in UP remains lower than in most other states, right, for a variety of historical reasons, right? And so there's the projection of might creates this, distorted representation about the actual number that sustain those majorities. At the national level, the BJP has a 51% majority, as a 51% presence in the Lok Sabha with 37% of the votes, right? It's a Raisin majority, right? It does not take, they lose 20 seats across, the Hindi belt, and they lose their majority in the Lok Sabha, right? So there are ways through which we sort of conflate or inflate the actual scale of BJP's dominance, which I think is useful to keep in mind.
Hi, my name is Surya. I'm a junior, and thank you so much for coming. It was a very interesting talk. I really had a great time because my parents are from Uttar Pradesh as well. And my grandfather actually ran for city council in Muzaffarnagar in the late 70s. And it was interesting, like hearing you talk about the occupations that people listed. I was just texting my dad while you were talking. His occupation was a sugar industrialist, so agriculture. And I think just one thing I was wondering was if a lot of people who had power in UP tended to be high caste and very wealthy. If you could like clarify how there was such a high turnover rate at times and how those two things were like correlated, or if that was at a different state level versus local level.
Thank you for a great question. So one way to answer your question is to, what was the requirement to gain power in UP in the past, or at the time where your grandfather ran for office, in Muzaffarnagar? You needed an upper caste status, you needed land, and you needed a Congress ticket, right? These were the base of power, right? And gradually, and I'm grossly simplifying a complex process of transformation, but those bases of individual power shifted from land to different forms of capital, grounded in new sectors or emerging sectors of economic activity. So some of the old ones like sugar remains, but construction and real estate and transport companies and basically all the business activities that have to deal with, the infrastructure, the building of the infrastructure of a growing economy, right? So from land to capital, from high caste status to caste numbers, right? The local configuration, the local demographic distribution in a given constituency. And from Congress, it went from a Congress ticket to what I call an ABC, which is anything but a Congress ticket, right? So it has to be, a major party ticket. And so that basically accounts, for the changing profile, because when those who have the resources come from sectors which are not a proprietary domain of a particular groups, could be banya and trades, it could be upper caste and ownership of public companies, it could be a lot of things, right? Position of influence. Then those emerging sector of activity are themselves super competitive.
Why is the turnout so high?
The turnout,
Election turnout. That is one of the large part of the question.
Turnout or turnover?
Turnout.
Turnout.
Why is it? The Lok Sabha elections were 65% plus for the first time in 2014, 2019. UP is about the same?
UP is lower.
60.
Yeah, actually.
58 to 60?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, not 65 plus. Okay.
No.
But that's all pretty high, yeah.
Yeah, but UP is usually lower. I think there's a range of explanations. There's an attachment for elections. Elections are meaningful, right? There's a lot at stake with whoever comes to power. That comes to your question about what happens to those local strongmen. MLAs may not matter much in a larger scheme of things, but they still matter locally, right? They still wield a lot of power and influence. So whose side you're on still matters a lot. So there's a lot at stake. Then there's a work by Mokolika Banerjee on the meaning of the vote, the fact that voting in itself is an enactment of the promise of citizenship and democratic equality. That even if elections don't deliver much for the most underserved segment of the population, they tend to vote more than others precisely because participating in an election provides a rare opportunity to make a tangible experience of what it means to be treated equally, right? And to be counted and to matter for politicians, parties, the state. But by the way, that old idiom that the more rural, the more remote, the more
lower caste,
the poorer you are, the more you vote, is no longer true. Turnout is higher in small towns.
This is another Modi-induced change.
Yeah.
That had been true since 1989. roughly.
Yeah.
But under Modi, the urban vote has gone up. Under Modi,
That's right.
right? So it's no longer, and the upper castes have returned, middle classes have returned to the voting booth,
Yeah.
which was, they had defected from there.
Yeah.
And that's what Yadav and Lokniti was repeatedly showing. Almost, they didn't say that they said that the lower caste, the rural people, the poor people were voting at least as much, if not more, than the upper caste, the richer, the urban, right? That was the idea, which itself was a new development after about 85 to 89.
Yeah.
And now the middle class, the urban, the upper caste has returned to the voting booth.
Yeah, I know that's correct.
Yes.
So
right.
there's necessarily, a multiplicity of factors that go into making the turnout at the level, where it is.
4 o'clock, time to conclude the session. But before we do so, a round of applause for this.